The healing tent still smelled of crushed yarrow and blood when Priscilla finally let her hands fall still. 3 wolves lay sleeping around her on cots of moss and linen, their breathing even now, their wounds closed by her work through the long hours of night. Her fingers ached. Her eyes burned. But none of that mattered when she pressed her palm to old Tomas's chest and felt his heartbeat steady beneath her touch. "You should rest," Tomas murmured, half-conscious, his words slurred with exhaustion. "You first," she whispered back, and he managed a weak laugh before sleep took him. Priscilla was the kind of healer who forgot herself entirely when others were hurting. It was a habit her grandmother used to scold her for: "You cannot pour from an empty cup, child," and it was a habit she had never managed to break. So when dawn light crept through the tent flaps and Elder Mirren appeared in the doorway, Priscilla had not slept in 2 full days. "The ceremony," Mirren said, not unkindly, but firm. "You must attend. All unmated wolves are required." Priscilla wiped her hands on her apron, the herbs ground into her skin like a second layer of color. "I have wolves who still need watching. Bethel will watch them." Mirren's eyes softened. "Priscilla, you cannot hide from this forever. Just attend. Stand in the back. No one will look twice at a healer from the smallest pack in the territory." She didn't believe that, not really, but she was too tired to argue. So she let them dress her, a borrowed gown the color of dusk, her hair braided loosely because her hands shook too much to do it properly, and she let them lead her toward Moonstone Arena, where the sky itself seemed to bend toward the ceremony grounds. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Alpha King Robert Carlos, ruler of the 5 packs, the wolf who had ended the Great War with his bare claws still slick with the blood of his enemies. They said his temper could level a building. They said he had not slept a full night in 4 years, that something dark followed him into every dream, that 3 healers had tried to ease his suffering and left the palace pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they'd seen in his eyes. They called him the most dangerous alpha in existence, and they said it the way you'd warn a child away from a cliff's edge. Priscilla had never imagined she would be close enough to find out if it was true. The arena was already roaring with thousands of voices by the time she slipped into the back rows. Torches lined the stone risers in long gold ribbons, and at the center of it all, raised on a dais of black granite, sat the throne, and the man. Even from this distance, he looked carved from something harder than flesh. Dark hair fell damp and heavy around a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so closed off, so still, like a door bolted from the inside. A crown of iron and moonstone sat low on his brow. His shoulders, wrapped in fur and ceremonial black, looked built to carry a weight no one else could lift. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply watched the crowd with the flat, exhausted patience of a man enduring something rather than living it. Priscilla's chest ached, looking at him. She didn't know why. The moon priestess began the ancient rites, her voice rising and falling in the old tongue, and the crowd hushed to a reverent murmur. Incense curled through the air, sweet and heavy. Priscilla's vision swam. She blinked hard, willing herself upright, but 2 days without sleep is a debt the body always collects, and it chose that exact moment to call hers due. The last thing she remembered was the priestess's chant blurring into a low hum, the torches softening into smears of gold, and her own head, impossibly heavy, tipping sideways. It landed on something solid. Warm. Smelling faintly of cedar and rain. A ripple of horrified silence spread outward from the dais like a stone dropped in still water. Somewhere, a guard's hand went to his blade. Someone gasped. The moon priestess's chant faltered and died. Priscilla slept on, unaware that her head now rested against the shoulder of Alpha King Robert Carlos, in front of every pack lord, noble, and citizen who had gathered beneath the moon. Robert went rigid. For years of instinct screamed at him to recoil, to summon his guards, to remind 10,000 witnesses exactly why no one dared touch him without permission. His wolf, always snarling somewhere beneath his skin, surged forward expecting a threat. Instead, it went still. For the first time in 4 years, the screaming in his skull, the low constant howl that lived behind his eyes every waking hour, simply stopped. He sat frozen, afraid that if he moved, the silence would shatter and the noise would come roaring back. A guard stepped forward, hand outstretched to pull the girl away. Robert lifted 2 fingers, barely, and the guard froze mid-stride. "Leave her," his eyes said. He did not push her away. He did not even shift his weight. He simply closed his eyes, slowly, like a man finally setting down something unbearably heavy, and for the first time in 4 years, Alpha King Robert Carlos felt something close enough to peace that he didn't dare name it, for fear it would disappear. By mid-morning, the story had already outrun her. Priscilla woke in her own bed, disoriented, with Bethel hovering over her looking somewhere between terrified and delighted. "You fell asleep," Bethel said, on the Alpha King's shoulder. "In front of everyone. And he didn't kill you." "I what?" Priscilla shot upright, the memory crashing back in pieces. The chanting. The heaviness in her limbs. The warmth under her cheek. "Oh, goddess. They're saying it's an omen. Some are saying you cursed the ceremony. Others say the king let you stay there on purpose." Bethel chewed her lip. "There were guards at the door this morning. They want you at the palace." Priscilla's stomach dropped somewhere near her boots. The ride to the capital felt like being marched to her own execution. She kept rehearsing apologies in her head. "I meant no disrespect, my king, I had not slept, I would never presume," until the palace gates rose ahead of her, black iron wolves snarling atop the stone, and every rehearsed word abandoned her at once. She was led not to a throne room or a court of judgment, but to a smaller chamber, warm, lit by low fire, lined with old books that smelled of leather and dust. Robert Carlos stood at the window with his back to her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'm told you've come to apologize," he said finally, without turning. "I have, my king. I never meant." "Don't." He turned then, and up close he was even more overwhelming, not just the size of him, the breadth of those fur-draped shoulders, but the sheer tiredness etched into his face, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "The headache I have lived with for 4 years. The one that wakes me before I've truly slept. It is gone. It has been gone since the moment your head touched my shoulder." Priscilla blinked. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," he admitted, and something in his voice cracked just slightly. A door left an inch open. "I want you to stay at the palace. Not as a prisoner. Not as anything you don't wish to be. I simply need to understand why a healer from the smallest pack in my territory can silence something I have not been able to silence myself." It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, watching him stand there, crown discarded somewhere, looking less like the most dangerous alpha in existence and more like a man who hadn't slept properly since the war ended, Priscilla felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "You don't have to call me, my king, here," he added, almost reluctantly, as if the words cost him something. "Robert is fine." "Then you don't have to stand like you're bracing for a fight every time I speak," she said before she could stop herself. For one suspended second, she thought she'd overstepped badly enough to end up back in her own pack's healing tent by sundown. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, rusted from disuse. "No one has spoken to me like that in a very long time. Would you like me to stop?" "No," he said, too quickly, and looked faintly surprised at himself. Over the following hours, Marcus, Robert's royal advisor, a lean gray-eyed wolf who watched Priscilla with the wary curiosity of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew, noticed the change first. The tightness around the king's eyes had eased. His hands, usually curled into fists even at rest, lay open on the armrest of his chair. The palace healers exchanged glances they thought no one saw. Priscilla stayed through dinner, mostly out of confusion about what else she was meant to do. Robert ate little, as he always did, but he asked her questions, real ones, not the empty courtesies of a king performing interest. What is it like, growing up in a pack where everyone knows your name? Do you miss the herb groves, when you're here? She found herself answering honestly, and somewhere between the second course and the last, she realized she had stopped being afraid of him. By the time the fire burned low, Priscilla had fallen asleep again, not against him this time, but beside him, curled in a chair too large for her, the day's exhaustion finally claiming her. Robert sat in the quiet, watching her breathe, unwilling to move and break whatever fragile thing had settled over the room. And for the first time in 4 years, sleep found him too, not the thin, restless half-sleep he'd grown used to, but something deep and dreamless and whole. He did not fight it. He simply let it take him, his shoulder angled carefully toward her so she would not wake, the silence in his mind finally, blessedly his own. Priscilla did not return to her pack the next morning. Or the morning after that. Each time she meant to leave, Robert found some reason, a healer's opinion needed on a wounded guard, a question about herbs that grew near her village, anything, and each time, she found she didn't mind staying. It became a rhythm neither of them named aloud. Mornings, she tended to the small infirmary the palace kept for its soldiers, her hands finding purpose the way they always did. Evenings, she found herself in Robert's study, or walking the gardens with him while the sky bruised purple and gold. "You hum when you're thinking," she told him one evening, watching him frown over a stack of reports. "Did you know that?" He looked up, startled. "I do not." "You absolutely do." Low, under your breath. "Right now you're doing it about," she squinted at the page he was holding, "grain tariffs, apparently. Very romantic. It is a kingdom, Priscilla. Someone has to think about grain. I'm only saying, for the most dangerous alpha in existence, you hum like a sleepy bumblebee." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, it happened slowly, like watching ice crack on a frozen lake, he laughed. Not a polite sound. A real one, surprised out of him, rough from disuse. Marcus, passing the study door with an armful of scrolls, nearly dropped them. It kept happening after that. Small things. She'd tease him without flinching, the way no noble or soldier in his service ever dared, and he'd catch himself smiling before he could stop it, quick, almost guilty, like a man caught doing something forbidden. He began seeking her out instead of waiting for her to appear. He'd find an excuse to walk past the infirmary in the afternoons. He started remembering things she mentioned only once, that she preferred chamomile to mint, that she hated the smell of burnt sage, that her grandmother used to call her little fox, and acting on them without comment, leaving a cup of chamomile tea by her elbow, having the kitchens quietly stop using sage in her wing of the palace. She noticed. Of course she noticed. And something in her chest warmed every time she did. "You don't have to do these things," she said one evening, turning the teacup in her hands. "I know," he said simply, and didn't explain further, and somehow that was answer enough. Not everyone was pleased. Court ladies who had once vied for the king's notice now watched Priscilla with sharp, assessing eyes. A pack lord's daughter cornered her near the rose terrace one afternoon, voice silk soft and cold. "A healer," she said, looking Priscilla over like an unwelcome stain, playing nursemaid to the king. "How charming. Does he know what you are, or only what you're useful for?" Priscilla kept her chin up, though the words landed harder than she let show. "I suppose he'll have to decide that for himself." She didn't tell Robert about the exchange. But that night, when she sat across from him in his study and he noticed her unusual quiet, he didn't press, he simply moved his chair closer, an inch, then another, until his shoulder was nearly touching hers, a silent offering of presence rather than words. It was such a small thing. It undid her completely. "I saw injured wolves dying in droves during the war," she admitted softly, not quite answering the question he hadn't asked. "I couldn't save half of them. I still hear it sometimes, the ones I lost." Robert went very still. "I carry mine too," he said. "Every single one." For a moment they simply sat in the shared weight of it, two people who understood loss in a language neither needed to translate for the other. It was the first time Priscilla saw past the crown and the legend entirely, saw a man who had buried his grief so deep it had calcified into the fearsome reputation everyone whispered about, when really, underneath, he was just tired. Just lonely. Just waiting for someone to sit close enough to notice. She fell asleep there again that night, exhaustion and the warmth of the fire pulling her under before she meant it to. Her head found his shoulder the way it had at the ceremony, except this time there was no shocked arena, no frozen guards, only the quiet study, the dying fire, and Robert going utterly, achingly still. Something in his chest, in the place where his wolf lived, restless and starving for 4 long years, rose up and recognized her. Not affection. Not comfort. Something older and far more dangerous to ignore. His wolf did not simply calm in her presence anymore. It reached for her. And deep beneath the palace, in a place no map could find, something that had been sleeping for 4 years stirred at the sound of a bond finally waking. The nightmare came for Robert just past midnight, the way it always did. Priscilla had stayed later than usual, the two of them reading by separate lamps in companionable silence, when his breathing changed beside her, shallow, ragged, his hands curling into fists against the armrests of his chair. A low sound tore out of him, more wolf than man, and his head tipped back as if something invisible had seized hold of him. Robert. She was at his side instantly, the healer's instinct overriding everything else. His skin burned beneath her palms. "Robert, wake up." He didn't wake. If anything, the tremor in him worsened, his jaw clenched so tight she feared he'd crack a tooth. Without thinking, she took his hand in both of hers, the way she did with frightened patience, murmuring the same low, steady words she'd used 1,000 times in the healing tents. "I'm here. You're not alone. I'm here." His fingers closed around hers like a man drowning catching driftwood. The room tilted. One moment she was kneeling at his chair, the next, the firelight, the books, the warm familiar study, all of it dissolved into cold, wet dark. Priscilla gasped, stumbling upright on uneven ground, and found herself standing in a forest unlike any she had ever walked. The trees here were black and leafless, twisted into shapes that looked almost like reaching hands. No moon hung overhead, only a strange, swallowed darkness, as if the sky itself had been blotted out. The air smelled of ash and old grief. "Robert?" Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Shapes moved between the trees. Not wolves. Not anything with a proper shape at all, shadows that flickered at the edge of her vision, gone the instant she turned to look directly at them. She pressed forward anyway, some instinct pulling her deeper, until she found him. He knelt in a clearing of dead grass, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Gone was the composed, armored king. Here he looked stripped bare, younger, somehow, and utterly broken, surrounded by a ring of pale, indistinct figures that drifted closer with every breath he took. "Robert." She ran to him, dropping to her knees in the cold dirt, pulling his face up to hers. His eyes, when they met hers, were hollow with an exhaustion that went bone deep. "I'm here. What is this place? You shouldn't be here." His voice cracked. "No one is supposed to follow me here." "What is this place?" she asked again, gentler this time, her thumb brushing along his jaw the way she might soothe an injured animal. The Eclipse Forest. He said it like a confession dragged out of him against his will. It isn't a dream, Priscilla. It's a prison. I come here every night. I have for 4 years. The figures circling them drew closer still, and now she could see them more clearly, translucent faces, mouths moving in silent accusation, hands outstretched as if reaching for something they'd lost. Priscilla's healer instinct screamed at her that this place was wrong in a way no wound or fever could ever be. This was a sickness of the soul. Who are they? She whispered. Robert didn't answer. He only closed his eyes, as if the question itself cost him more than he could bear to pay. She held him there in the cold and the dark, refusing to let go even as the shadows pressed in, even as something ancient and starving seemed to coil tighter around the clearing. For the first time, she understood, truly understood, that the rumors about his curse were not exaggeration. This was real. This was what he carried alone, every single night, while the kingdom slept and called him fearsome and untouchable. She didn't see him as dangerous anymore. She saw a man drowning, quietly, for 4 straight years, with no one brave enough to wade in after him. I'm not leaving, she said fiercely, gripping his hand tighter. Whatever this is. Whatever's hunting you here. I'm not leaving you to face it alone. Something shifted in the dark around them, a ripple, like a held breath. One of the shadow shapes paused mid-drift, its featureless face turning, slowly, unmistakably, toward Priscilla. It hadn't noticed her before. It noticed her now. A whisper moved through the dead trees, dry and hungry, curling around her like smoke finding a crack beneath a door, and Robert's hand convulsed around hers, his eyes snapping open in sudden, sharp alarm. No, he breathed. No, no, it isn't supposed to see you. Whatever lived in the Eclipse Forest had just learned Priscilla's name. And somewhere in the freezing dark, it began, very softly, to smile. They woke tangled together on the study floor, the fire long since burned to embers, Robert's arms locked around her like he meant to never let go again. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The cold of the Eclipse Forest still clung to Priscilla's skin, a memory her body refused to release. It saw me, she finally said. I know. His voice was rough with something close to fear, a sound she had never once heard from him, not even facing down rebellious pack lords in open court. I'm sorry. I should never have let you stay close enough to be pulled in. You didn't let anything happen, Robert. I held your hand. That was my choice. She pushed herself up to look at him properly, and what she saw in his face stopped her breath, not the composed mask of a king, but raw, undisguised terror, the kind that comes only from loving something you're certain you'll destroy. She didn't understand that yet. Not fully. But she would. The following days, she searched for answers the only way she knew how, buried in the palace archive, surrounded by mating records older than the kingdom itself, dust thick on bindings no one had opened in a century. An elder wolf named Yusra, ancient enough to remember when the moon goddess's rites were still performed in their original tongue, found her there past midnight, hunched over a brittle scroll. You're looking for confirmation of something you already know, Yusra said, settling into the chair across from her with the patience of someone who had outlived urgency. I don't know anything, Priscilla admitted. I only know that when I'm near him, something in my chest aches like it's reaching for something. And when I'm not, I feel it too, like a held breath I can't release. Yusra's weathered face softened. Child, that is not a question. That is a mate bond announcing itself. Marcus confirmed it more bluntly the next morning, cornering her in the corridor with the look of a man who had been holding his tongue out of respect and simply couldn't anymore. He recognized your scent the moment you walked into that ceremony tent, he said. I've served him 12 years. I have never seen him still the way he goes around you. He knows, Priscilla. He's known since the first night. That evening, Robert found her in the garden beneath the white blossom trees, moonlight silvering everything it touched. He didn't speak first, only reached for her hand, the way he had begun to do without thinking, threading his fingers through hers like it was the most natural gesture in the world. "Marcus told you," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "Tell me yourself," she said. "Please." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might retreat behind the crown again, the way he sometimes did when things grew too tender to bear. But then his thumb traced slow, absent circles over her knuckles, and he exhaled like a man laying something down at last. "Priscilla, you are my mate." The words came out low, almost disbelieving, as though saying them aloud made them more real and more frightening at once. "I knew it the moment your head touched my shoulder. The goddess does not choose carelessly. She chose you to undo 4 years of silence I thought would last forever." Her heart climbed into her throat. Every secret ache, every unnamed longing of the past weeks suddenly had a name, a shape, a truth she could finally hold. "Robert. Don't." He pressed his forehead to hers, eyes shut, breathing unsteady. "Don't say it back yet. Not until you understand what it means to be tied to me." "I don't care what it means." "You should." His voice cracked on the word, and when he pulled back to look at her, the joy she'd glimpsed only moments ago had drained into something hollow and resolved. "The Eclipse Forest noticed you. It has never noticed anyone but me in 4 years. If the bond between us deepens, it will reach for you the way it reaches for me. I have spent 4 years protecting this kingdom from what's inside me. I will not let it take you too." "Robert, wait." But he had already stepped back, already rebuilt the wall around himself brick by careful brick, his expression closing like a door bolted from within. "You should go home," he said, and every word cost him visibly, like tearing something out of his own chest. "Tonight. Back to your pack. Far from me, and far from whatever waits in that forest." "You don't mean that." "I have never meant anything more in my life," he said, voice breaking even as his face stayed terrifyingly still. "Because I would rather live the rest of my years in that nightmare alone than watch it take you from me too." The journey back to her pack felt longer than it had any right to be. Priscilla sat stiff and silent in the carriage, watching the palace towers shrink behind her, and told herself this was for the best. That Robert was right. That love sometimes meant walking away before you could ruin someone with your presence. She did not believe a single word of it, but she told herself anyway. Home looked the same, the modest healing tents, the familiar smell of crushed herbs, Bethel's relieved embrace at the gate. For the first day, Priscilla threw herself into work, tending wounds, grinding salves, trying to fill the hollow space in her chest with purpose the way she always had. It didn't work. By the second night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, her wolf pacing inside her like a caged thing, restless and grieving something it couldn't name aloud. By the end of the first week, she had stopped sleeping properly altogether. Food lost its taste. Her hands, usually so steady over a wound, trembled faintly when she worked. Old Tomas, the wolf she had nursed back to health weeks ago, watched her with growing concern. "You're fading, girl," he said one evening, voice gruff with worry. "Whatever happens at that palace, it's eating you alive." She didn't have the words to explain that it wasn't the palace. It was the absence of one man's presence, carved into her like a missing limb. Miles away, Robert was faring far worse. Without Priscilla beside him, the silence in his mind shattered back into screaming static within a single night. The headaches returned tenfold, vicious and unrelenting. He stopped sleeping entirely, pacing his chambers until dawn, his wolf snarling beneath his skin with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with a bond severed before it could fully take root. Marcus found him on the third night collapsed against his study wall, breathing ragged, sweat soaking through his shirt. "This is killing you," Marcus said, kneeling beside him, fear plain in his usually composed face. Robert. You have to send it to her. No. The word came out cracked, but final. I would rather die slowly than watch the forest take her instead of me. The Eclipse Forest, it seemed, had other plans. Each night Robert was dragged into its cold embrace, the shadows grew bolder, the dead voices louder, the trees themselves seeming to press closer around him as though sensing weakness and preparing to feed. What had once taken hours to overwhelm him now took minutes. The palace healers exchanged grim, frightened glances behind his back. None of them said the word aloud, but all of them were thinking it. He might not survive this. Priscilla didn't know any of that, not yet. What she knew was a feeling that grew sharper every day, an ache low and constant beneath her ribs, like her own heartbeat had been split in two and half of it now lived somewhere far away, struggling. She woke one night from a fitful half-sleep, gasping, certain, that something terrible was happening to him, though she had no proof beyond the bond pulling taut in her chest like a wire about to snap. I have to go back, she told Bethel the next morning, already packing what little she'd brought home with her. Priscilla, he sent you away. He told you to stay. He told me to stay safe, Priscilla said, fastening her cloak with shaking hands. He didn't ask what I wanted. I would rather face whatever is in that forest beside him than live a long, safe life without him in it. It was Yusra who stopped her at the village edge, the old wolf who had first named the bond weeks ago, her face drawn with an urgency Priscilla hadn't seen in her before. There is something you need to understand before you go back, Yusra said, gripping Priscilla's arm with surprising strength. The mate bond is not one-sided, child. It does not simply tie his life to yours in feeling alone. If Robert dies before the bond is fully sealed, it will not release you gently. It will tear itself out of you. The Eclipse Forest does not only threaten him anymore. Priscilla went very still. It will kill me too. It might, Yusra said gravely. Or worse, it may simply leave you half a person for the rest of your years, grieving a bond your soul can never fully forget. For one long moment, fear closed cold fingers around Priscilla's throat. She thought of the shadow in the forest turning toward her, learning her name, smiling in the dark. She thought of Robert's hollow, terrified eyes the night he sent her away, trying so hard to protect her that he hadn't once considered what protecting her might cost them both. Then she thought of his laugh, rusted and surprised, the first time she'd teased him into smiling. She thought of his hand finding hers without hesitation in the garden. She thought of a man who had carried 4 years of grief utterly alone, certain he deserved every second of it. Then I suppose, Priscilla said quietly, fastening the last clasp of her cloak, we finish what was started. Together, or not at all. She did not wait for Yusra's blessing. She turned toward the road back to the palace, and began to run. The palace gates were already in chaos when Priscilla arrived, breathless, her cloak torn from the speed of her run. Guards moved in tense clusters. Healers crossed the courtyard with grim, hurried faces. She caught Marcus's arm the moment she spotted him. Where is he? Marcus's relief at seeing her was so plain it frightened her more than his words. His chambers. Priscilla, he's barely conscious. He hasn't slept in days. We didn't know how to reach you. She didn't wait to hear the rest. She ran. She found him collapsed against the side of his bed, not in it, as though he'd been trying to stand and failed halfway. His skin had gone pale beneath its usual warmth, dark circles bruised deep under his eyes, his breathing shallow and uneven. For one terrible second she thought she was too late. Then his eyes opened, unfocused, and found her anyway, as if some part of him had known she was there before his senses confirmed it. Priscilla. Her name came out cracked, disbelieving. You shouldn't have come back. Stop telling me what I shouldn't do. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands already moving over him with a healer's urgency, though she knew in her heart this wasn't a wound her salves could close. I told you. I would rather face this with you than live safely without you. You don't understand what you're risking. I understand perfectly. Her voice broke on the words, for years of his loneliness and 1 week of her own suffering finally spilling over at once. Yusra told me everything, Robert. If you die, I might die too. So you don't get to protect me by pushing me away. You only get to protect both of us by letting me stay. He stared at her, something raw and disbelieving moving behind his exhausted eyes. I have spent every day since the ceremony terrified of loving you, he admitted, the confession dragged out of him like it had been buried under 4 years of rubble. Terrified that the one good thing left in my life would be the thing the forest finally takes from me. I thought if I sent you away, I could spare you that. I was wrong. All I did was make us both suffer apart instead of finding a way to survive this together. Then stop trying to survive it alone. She cupped his face in both hands, the way she had in the Eclipse forest, except this time there was no cold dark pressing in around them, only the quiet of his chamber, and the truth finally unspoken between them breaking free. I love you, Robert Carlos. Not the legend. Not the crown. You, tired, and grieving, and trying so hard to carry a kingdom's weight that you forgot you're allowed to be loved too. Something in him gave way entirely. He pulled her against him with a force that spoke of 4 years of restraint finally collapsing, and when he kissed her, it wasn't careful or measured, it was a man finally allowing himself the one thing he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. She felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the place where her own wolf had been pacing and aching for a week, a sudden, overwhelming sense of home. The room seemed to hum with it. Moonlight spilled through the high windows though there had been no moon visible an hour before, silver and warm, wrapping around them like a blessing offered rather than demanded. Robert's hand found the curve of her jaw, reverent, like she was something he still couldn't quite believe was real. Are you certain? He murmured against her lips, giving her one last chance to step back from the edge of everything that came next. I have never been more certain of anything, she whispered back. What followed was not spoken of afterward in court gossip, nor would it need to be, it lived instead in the quiet, sacred space between two people who had each spent years convinced they didn't deserve to be chosen, finally choosing each other completely. Their wolves recognized one another fully at last, a recognition older than either of them, older than the kingdom itself, written into the stars long before they'd ever met. When the bond was sealed between them, it didn't feel like chains. It felt like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to fill all the way. Afterward, in the hush of early morning, Robert lay with Priscilla curled against his chest, her hand resting over the steady, unburdened rhythm of his heart, and for the first time he let himself believe that maybe, he had earned this. I love you, he said quietly into her hair, the words still unfamiliar on his tongue, still precious for their newness. I have loved you since the moment you fell asleep on my shoulder and silenced 4 years of screaming in my head. She smiled against his skin, eyes growing heavy with the kind of peace neither of them had known in far too long. Then I suppose it's a good thing I was so terribly tired. He laughed, soft, real, unguarded, and pressed a kiss to her brow. Then, without warning, Priscilla gasped, her body going rigid in his arms. The warm moonlight in the room flickered, dimmed, and the floor beneath them seemed to fall away entirely. The Eclipse forest had found her again, and this time, it pulled her in deeper than ever before. The cold hit her first, then the dark, but this time it was deeper, denser, the trees so thick overhead that no light, however faint, pierced through. Priscilla stumbled forward, calling Robert's name into a silence that swallowed the sound whole. She found him at the center of a vast, sunken clearing, kneeling among thousands of pale, drifting figures. They surrounded him in concentric rings, close enough now to touch, their hollow faces turned toward him in silent, endless accusation. Robert knelt with his head bowed, shoulders shaking, looking smaller than she had ever seen him, not a king, not even a man, but a boy who had never forgiven himself for something he hadn't yet told her. Robert. She pushed through the ring of spirits, ignoring the cold that bled through her skin where they brushed past her. He didn't lift his head. They never stop, he whispered. They never stop reminding me. The figures began to shift, their forms bending and rippling like reflections on disturbed water, and suddenly Priscilla was no longer simply watching, she was inside a memory, the forest falling away into something else entirely. A battlefield, scorched and smoking. Soldiers in mismatched armor clashing beneath a blood-red sky. And at the center of it, a younger Robert, scarred and desperate, fighting not for glory but for survival, for the survival of everyone behind him. She saw a woman then, young, dressed in the pale robes of a peace envoy, hands raised, pleading for both sides to stop. Ilara. The name came to Priscilla unbidden, as though the memory itself whispered it into her mind. She watched the negotiation collapse in chaos, watched Ilara step between two clashing forces in one final, desperate attempt to halt the slaughter, watched young Robert's face contort in horror as he realized, a heartbeat too late, what was about to happen. The vision shattered. Priscilla was back in the clearing, gasping, Robert's anguished sobs the only sound besides the whispering dead. I was supposed to protect her, he choked out, finally lifting his face to Priscilla's, and what she saw there broke something open in her chest. She believed peace was still possible. I told her it was safe to step forward. I told her I would protect the negotiation. And she died because I was wrong. Robert. I have carried every death from that war, he continued, voice raw and unraveling, but hers most of all. Because I gave her my word. I have spent 4 years letting this place punish me for it, because some broken part of me believes I deserve every second of it. Priscilla looked around at the spirits drifting closer, their faces no longer simply accusing but almost hungry, feeding on something she finally understood with sudden, devastating clarity. This isn't dark magic, she breathed. This is your guilt, Robert. The curse isn't something that was done to you. It's something you built yourself, stone by stone, every night you refuse to let yourself heal. How do I stop building it, he asked, voice breaking entirely, when I don't know how to stop believing I deserve it. The spirits pressed closer at his despair, growing more solid, more defined, as though his self-condemnation fed them strength with every word. Priscilla felt the cold deepen, felt something vast and starving stir at the edges of the clearing, drawn by 4 years of accumulated guilt finally cracking open all at once. Robert, look at me. She gripped his face in both hands, forcing his hollow eyes to meet hers even as the ghosts swelled around them, even as the temperature dropped further still. You did not kill Ilara. The war killed her. You were a young alpha trying to hold together a kingdom on fire, and you made the only choice you had with the information you had. That is not a crime. That is the weight every leader carries, and you have carried it alone for 4 years because you believed no one else was strong enough to help you set it down. I should have known. You couldn't have known, she said fiercely, tears slipping unchecked down her face now, the forest's cold biting at her skin. Nobody can know everything before it happens, Robert. You can spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for a single unbearable moment, or you can let yourself grieve it properly and keep living anyway. Ilara gave her life trying to bring peace. Don't let her sacrifice become the reason you destroy yourself slowly for the rest of your years. That isn't honoring her memory. That's wasting it. The spirits around them had drawn so close now that their cold fingers brushed against Robert's shoulders, his arms, his bowed head, the weight of 4 years finally, fully descending. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a roar, something torn loose from somewhere deep and ancient inside him, the dam finally, catastrophically breaking after years of careful restraint. I don't know how to forgive myself, he admitted, the words shattering out of him into the freezing dark. I don't know how. The ghosts surged forward as one, a wave of pale, hungry shapes closing in around him, and for one terrible moment Priscilla feared she had arrived too late, that whatever lived in this forest intended to consume him completely, here, now, with her watching helplessly beside him. Then let me show you, she whispered, wrapping her arms around him as the dark closed in from every side. Let me carry it with you, Robert. You don't have to forgive yourself alone. The ghosts surged closer, a tide of pale grief and old accusation, and Priscilla did the only thing her heart knew how to do. She stepped fully between them and Robert, planting her feet in the frozen ground, and refused to move. You don't get him, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, ringing out into the dark like a struck bell. Not tonight. Not ever again. The figures hesitated, not from fear, but from something closer to confusion, as though no one had ever stood against them before. Behind her, Robert's hand found her shoulder, trembling but present, no longer collapsed in despair but rising, slowly, to stand beside her instead of beneath the weight alone. He carries every one of you, Priscilla continued, looking out at the drifting, hollow faces, every loss, every grief, every moment he believes he failed. But guilt this heavy was never meant to be carried forever. He fought to protect his people. He gave everything he had, and it was not enough to save everyone, because nothing ever could have been. That does not make him a monster. That makes him a man who loved his kingdom enough to nearly destroy himself trying to save it. She turned to Robert, tears bright on her face, and took both his hands in hers. You are not responsible for every death in that war, Robert Carlos. You fought to protect your people, and you succeeded more than you've ever let yourself believe. You deserve forgiveness. You deserve peace. You deserve love, and I am not going anywhere until you let yourself have it. For a long, suspended moment, nothing moved. The spirits hung frozen in the dark, the forest holding its breath. Then, slowly, Robert closed his eyes, not in despair this time, but in surrender of an entirely different kind. Something in his chest, knotted tight for 4 unbearable years, finally began, gently, to loosen. I forgive myself, he whispered, the words trembling but true, said aloud for the first time since the war had ended. I forgive myself. The forest shuddered. The pale figures around them began to soften, their hollow accusation melting into something closer to release, drifting upward like smoke finally let free from a sealed chamber. The trees themselves seemed to exhale, their twisted black branches softening into shapes far less menacing, and the absolute dark overhead cracked at last, a single thread of pale moonlight breaking through. The shadows did not fight to stay. They simply faded, one by one, until the eclipse forest itself began to dissolve around them, not violently, but peacefully, like a wound finally permitted to close after years left open. Robert gasped as though surfacing from deep water, and the forest was gone. He woke in his own bed, sunlight, real sunlight, warm and golden, pouring through the windows of his chamber, Priscilla curled safely against his side. For the first time in 4 years, his mind held nothing but quiet. No screaming. No headache pressing behind his eyes. No nightmare waiting at the edge of sleep. Just stillness, whole and undisturbed. It's gone, he breathed, disbelieving, pressing a hand to his own chest as though checking for a wound that had simply vanished. Priscilla. It's truly gone. She smiled against his shoulder, eyes still heavy with sleep. I told you. You didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Word of the king's recovery spread through the palace within hours, and through the kingdom within days. Robert Carlos, the most dangerous alpha in existence, the man who had not slept a full night in 4 years, stood before his court with color in his face and steadiness in his stride for the first time anyone could remember. And beside him, hand laced firmly in his, stood Priscilla. This is my mate, he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered hall without a single trace of hesitation. Chosen by the moon goddess herself. I will hear no objection to her place at my side. A few nobles bristled, whispers of a healer, from the smallest pack rippling briefly through the crowd, but Robert's gaze, sharp and unwavering, silenced them before the words could fully form. She silenced a curse I could not silence myself, he said. She walked into my darkest nightmare and refused to leave me there. If that is not worthy of a queen, then I do not know what is. No one argued further. The royal mating ceremony that followed was unlike any the kingdom had seen in generations, not the cold, formal rite of the past, but a celebration woven through with warmth and genuine joy. Under the full blessing of the moon goddess, surrounded by thousands who had once feared their king's wrath and now witnessed only his happiness, Priscilla became Luna Queen. Months passed. The kingdom settled into a peace it had not known in years, and Robert Carlos, once the most feared and dangerous alpha in existence, became known instead for something far rarer, a king who had found his way back from the dark, and never let go of the hand that pulled him out. One quiet evening, a visiting noble found them curled together by the fire, Priscilla asleep against Robert's shoulder exactly as she had been that very first night. How did the most dangerous alpha in existence find his mate? The noble asked, half in jest. Robert glanced down at Priscilla, smiling, soft, easy, entirely unguarded, and pressed a kiss to her hair. She fell asleep on my shoulder, he said simply, and I never let her go. Thank you for listening to Story. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and join the pack for more romance stories.